Good morning, my students. Sorry that I can't be with you guys today. I got some sick kiddos at home, so we're going to try to just do this this way, and hopefully we'll get everything covered. So, if you will remember, last class we were together, we started talking about this whole idea of presidential power and how presidential power has grown over time. And so last class we talked about this notion of formal powers. Remember, formal powers you'll find specifically in the Constitution. You can open up Article 2, Section 2, and you can find them written down. Inherent powers or informal powers, those are just things that we know that presidents can have. So this is not going to be an exhaustive list. To be honest with you, anytime that a president uses their authority and they're able to accomplish something and it's successful, then that sometimes becomes one of those informal, or it's just an inherent power. An example of an inherent power, you guys might remember learning about in U.S. history, a long time ago, about Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. Technically, Jefferson didn't really have the authority to commit and to comply and follow through on the Louisiana Purchase. But he just kind of did it. And it worked, and we're happy, and it was all good. So it's just when presidents behave in an executive way, in ways that we intrinsically accept and know are okay. So the first one on our list is an executive agreement. I believe I covered this last class, but just to make sure. An executive agreement is like a treaty. It's when our executive makes an agreement with another foreign head of state, but the difference is they don't get any kind of Senate approval for it. So it's simply just kind of a one-off thing. An example would be the Yalta Accords after the war, when we had to decide, okay, how are we going to divide Germany up in terms of like the different quadrants? That was an executive agreement. The president didn't go to the Senate and get approval. But like I said, usually it's just to kind of settle a one-time kind of thing. It's not this like long-lasting type relationship. The president can use the power of his or her office and just kind of go public. Bully pulpit is a phrase that came into vogue. We talked about it with Teddy Roosevelt. And ever since then, it's just this idea that the president can use his position to kind of push people around a little bit. In the homework, for those of you that watch the videos, the Reagan video is a phenomenal example of bully pulpit. And if you notice, like he wasn't aggressive, he wasn't like unkind or ungracious like that might sound. He used his natural communication skills to try to persuade the American public to put pressure on Congress. LBJ did the same thing. He just did his in a different way. He used his knowledge of Congress and his specific relationships to try to, and his very imposing presence and just kind of the way that he had to put pressure on people. President Trump is doing this with Twitter. Is a great example of this whole idea of going public, where he says, I'm going to bypass everything else. I'm going to go straight to the people and make sure they know what I want. Executive orders. Executive orders are sometimes controversial, sometimes not. They require, it's when the president issues a directive and it carries the weight of law, but it's not a law. So a law is more powerful than an executive order, but typically they don't contradict. Oftentimes presidents will reverse each other's executive orders. So an example would be, if you go back to Bush 41, he issued an executive order that said that any medical facility that receives federal dollars is not allowed to offer abortion counseling services. So then when Clinton was elected, he rescinded that. Then when Bush 43 was elected, he put it back in place. Then when Obama was elected, he rescinded it. So sometimes that happens. And the executive orders can be for very non-controversial things. FDR issued one to change Thanksgiving and to move it back a week and make the holiday shopping season an extra week longer to try to help the economy. We do them to create monuments. There have been over 15,000 executive orders on record. So we'll watch a short little SNL clip to try to understand why they are so controversial. Maybe I can find it. Here we go.
We get it. Still working on both.
Or not. Try again.
Training thing. Cute. building in Washington, D.C. Say, what's that piece of paper doing here? Oh, you mean me? I'll tell you who I am. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill. Cool. What kind of bill are you? Well, I'm an immigration bill. And one day the Republicans might create me so I could become a law. And how does a bill become a law? Funny you should ask. Well, first I go to the House and they vote on me. But then I need from the Senate a majority. And if I pass the legislative test, then I wind up on the president's desk. And I say, oh, my feet, put your weapon. My legs, they were made of paper. President Obama, what's the big idea? That bill was trying to become a law.
I realize that. But you know, son, there's actually an even easier way to get things done around here. It's called an executive order.
I'm an executive order, and I pretty much just happened. And that's it. Wait a second, don't you have to go through Congress at some point? Oh, that's adorable. You still think that's how government works? Don't listen to him, son. Look at the midterm elections. People clearly...
All right, it's freezing, but you guys pretty much get it. So an executive order is where the... Whoop, there we go. So an executive order is where the president issues this directive, and like the strip said, it just kind of happens. Like I said, they can be for controversial things, they can be for non-controversial things. I typically think of the appropriate use of executive order is for the president to fill in the gaps of the law. You know, a law is written, the president doesn't quite, the law is not quite clear, and it's just a directive. As chief executive, he's simply telling the bureaucracy, this is how I want you to carry out the law. But obviously, with our modern party polarization, where we've experienced divided government for so long, a lot of modern presidents have used it as a way around Congress when they can't get Congress to comply with what it is that they want. Signing statements. This is relatively recent as well. I mean, we've had early presidents use these. They've become more frequent as of late. A signing statement, is when a president signs a bill and then they issue a statement in conjunction with that bill that says how they intend to enforce it. And sometimes it implies selective enforcement, meaning that I'm going to ignore parts of it. This comes about, modern presidents, the American president used to have this power called a line item veto. And what would happen is the president would mark out the parts they didn't like, and then they would sign it, approving the rest of the parts. So there was a case called Clinton versus New York, and the Supreme Court ruled that line item veto was unconstitutional for the American president. And the reason was it made him like a lawmaker. And they said that violated the constitutional concept of separation of powers because it gave the president too many legislative powers. So subsequently, presidents since Clinton have then used signing statements as kind of a way around that. Emergency powers. This is not really like a formal term. This is just my way of saying that we allow our presidents to behave differently during a time of crisis. Last class we talked about the whole Lincoln and the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, but if you remember, FDR did that as well. Executive Order 9066 declared during a time of war that we were going to detain people based on their ethnicity or their national origin. That's not something that we would allow to do during a time of peace, but during a time of crisis, we tend to cede power to our president. Executive privilege. This is a tough one for people. It's hard to understand because it's incredibly narrow. What executive privilege means is that presidents are not above the law, except when they are above the law. So there are time periods where the American president might not have to comply with the law. They might not have to comply with some kind of orders. For example, if you or I were issued a subpoena, that would mean that we would have to show up to court and we'd be required to testify. Well, if the president were subpoenaed, what if he's going to be the questions that he's going to be asked might create some kind of national crisis, or they could be a national security breach. So the president can claim executive privilege and potentially not have to comply with those orders. So this is very narrow. You're going to look at a case in just a little bit where the court defined executive privilege and they told the president he didn't have it, but they said it was a very real thing. And then finally, we just have this idea of the institutional presidency. You know, the American president, the presidency carries with it this authority regardless of who the person is. You know, our last two presidents have been pretty polarizing. People have really liked them or really not liked them. But I think that as a whole, I hope there is still some kind of respect for the office. So that if the president walks in the room, people stand up. There's a certain authority when we refer to the president as Mr. President, that there's something that kind of comes along with that, and that allows the president to use that to influence others. Okay, as I said before, this is not an exhaustive list, but it at least kind of gives you an idea of what informal power is like. Okay, so everybody flip your paper over to the back of the page, and I want you all to work on discussion question 2. So why don't you take like 3 minutes just to kind of talk through it a little bit and then share your answers there at your table.